Hey guys, Pastor James here, Faith Fellowship Online. Listen, if you're listening in out there, let us know. Comment on the feed this morning. Let us know where you're watching from. Feel free to ask questions or say anything you want to say out there. Also, if you're watching this on our YouTube channel today, let us know and feel free to like, rate, and review our channel so that we can get seen and get our word out there. This morning, I've got a question for you. So here it is. Have you ever wondered how somebody good can go down like they did something bad? Like somebody who didn't deserve it, somebody who didn't do anything wrong, ends up going down for something that they never had anything to do with. That happens, right? Maybe you've seen it in your life somewhere. Maybe it was you that it happened to. Maybe you were involved, but you didn't deserve to have what happened to you. You know, maybe your reputation got butchered by somebody without any proof, or maybe you got stuck cleaning up a mess that you didn't make. Maybe you're just trying to help somebody, and then you ended up footing the bill. How does that even happen? I mean, it shouldn't happen, right? It shouldn't happen when things are in order and we have a culture and a society like we have in America in 2020. But here's the thing, it does happen, and you know that it happens. The question is, how does it happen and why? All right, so I'm going to take you to a place in Mark this morning, the Gospel of Mark. And today we're continuing with our series, The Bad Guy, Part 3. And today we're looking at the people who wanted Jesus dead. The Sanhedrin. Yeah, 71 people, you wouldn't know this, but 71 people were part of a religious group whose duty it was to make sure that things were done the right way in the religious community, the Jewish community. Even though they were under Roman rule, these guys were really the head of the spiritual society, the entire society of Judaism. And it's not too hard to figure out why they wanted Jesus dead. The facts were that the people were in a rough place, and they hated their government. They didn't really trust their spiritual leaders all that much. They didn't have as much respect for them as you might think. And there was a lot of political corruption. A lot of rebellions would pop up. People would get hurt because of them. People were confused. People were fearful. And so in walks a man who's capturing the attention of pretty much everybody and doing all kinds of miracles, just elaborate, amazing things no one had ever seen done, no one had ever even claimed to have done before. And that's great, except he openly criticizes the religious rulers of the day. Openly criticizes. Listen to this. Matthew 23. They don't practice what they teach. They crush people with unbearable religious demands and never lift a finger to ease the burden. Everything they do is for show. This is Jesus talking. He says, "What sorrow awaits you teachers of religious law and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are so careful to clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside you are filthy, full of greed and self-indulgence. Snakes, sons of vipers, how will you escape the judgment of hell?" That's Jesus speaking. Jesus challenged their sense of identity in a way no one had ever challenged their sense of identity. He basically looked at them and said, "Look, guys, you're supposed to be responsible for teaching people how to be good in God's eyes, and you're really not that good. In fact, you're bad. You're not the good guys, you're the bad guys." So it's not that hard to imagine they wanted Jesus out of the picture. But what is hard to imagine is how 71 people who had committed their entire lives to doing right in God's eyes and going by the book, strictly by the book where God was concerned, following the commandments, giving everything that was prescribed to give right on time, praying at the right times of day, every day with consistency where everybody could see. These guys somehow managed to take an innocent man and using their own system convict him for something he really didn't do anything wrong, and kill him for it. So what I want you to see is how it happened. So walk with me in Mark for a little bit, and listen to this. Here's Jesus being arrested in the middle of the night, and it says, "They led Jesus away to the high priest, and all the chief priests and elders and the scribes gathered together." They're going to have a trial. Now, what you don't know is that in the Sanhedrin and then their rules and their code of conduct, they actually had an elaborate setup to make sure that guilty people were found to be guilty, but innocent people were kept out of punishment. They were kept out of prison, kept out of jail, kept out of punishment. They had an elaborate system. They had a lot of the things that actually our own justice system is built on today because they were so fair, they were so right, they were so good. Listen to this. So they didn't just arrest people for serious crimes and then kill them on a whim. They didn't do that. It wasn't done. They had 71 jurors, not just 5 or 6 or 12 or a handful of somebody's friends picked out of the back office someplace. They had 71 jurors who would have to come up one at a time and deliver their verdict in person. They would have to answer for their own personal verdict every single time. And for crimes that were actually anticipating maybe a death penalty, they would actually wait an entire 24 hours at least after they had heard all of the evidence and wait that period of time so that emotions wouldn't be so high, and they would take some time to really think and be subjective before they could give a guilty verdict that would result in death. Even more, witnesses. They actually had to have witnesses, and they couldn't just be 2 or 3 people that knew each other, and they couldn't just, kind of get together before they got brought in and kind of get their story straight. They would take each of the witnesses in aside individually, and they would just grill them about all kinds of things, all little tiny details, in a way that they couldn't prepare for. And they would make sure that no matter what, if the witnesses didn't line up, if their stories didn't line up, even in the tiny little details, they wouldn't take any of the testimony. They couldn't use it. It wasn't good enough. So listen to what happens when Jesus gets brought in. It says, "Now the chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain testimony against Jesus to put him to death. They were not finding any. For many were giving false testimony about him, and yet their testimony was not consistent." They couldn't get their stories to line up in those tiny details. It was made up. It was a hoax. It says, "And some stood up to give false testimony against him, saying, 'We heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another made without hands.' And not even in this respect was their testimony consistent." So they couldn't even make up the same fabricated story or the same interpretation of the thing that they thought that Jesus might have said that was actually terrible. They couldn't even get that straight. And they're in such a hurry to get this thing under wraps. They just set this thing up and they push and they push and they push. And they're in the middle of the night, by the way, which they were never supposed to do. They never had a trial in the middle of the night. They were always supposed to have a trial in the daytime where people would have a chance to find out about it and hear about it and come and see who was coming and going and hear what it was about. But these guys do it in the middle of the night, some kind of crazy kangaroo hurry-up court. And they're pulling people out of bed, basically, looking for witnesses, and they can't get these people to line up their stories. They just aren't credible because they're making it up. And then the high priest, the boss of the whole court, comes up to Jesus, and he says, after all of this nonsense, he says, "Do you make no answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you?" In other words, he doesn't even know what to say about all this stuff, but he's just reaching and grasping at straws. Well, what are these guys all talking about? You explain to me all of their made-up stuff. Why are they saying these things? Of course, they don't get anything out of Jesus. Nothing. No, he's not going to say anything to that. He's not going to glorify that with an answer. He just sits there and waits for the man to be done. But he doesn't give up, and he says, he comes right out. He's so frustrated. He does something he never would have done normally. It's actually against the rules. He comes out and asks him a question to try and get him to incriminate himself, which it wasn't allowed. It wasn't a thing. And he just sets him right up. He just comes point blank. He's so frustrated. He says, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" Well, it's a direct question, and Jesus answers it directly. He says, "I am, and you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." The chief priest puts on a real show here. He's so angry, or at least he wants people to see how outraged he is. He grabs his clothes and starts ripping his own clothes right in half, right on his body, right in front of everybody. He's just so outraged. And then he yells this. He says, "What further need do we have for witnesses? You heard the blasphemy. How does it seem to you?" In other words, you know what? This is so terrible. We don't need witnesses. We don't need to do it by the book this time. This is you, the jury. You are the witnesses. This is enough. We saw it. That's good enough. We saw it. We heard it. And it says, and they all condemned him to be deserving of death. How did they do that? How did they take an innocent person and use this system and end up condemning this man to death? Well, it's obvious to me that in their minds, at every leg of the journey, every little step along the path, they decided it was okay to do a little bit of wrong in order to do a lot of good. Every single step in the process, they bent a corner someplace in order to force this thing along, speed it up, hurry it up, because to them it was so important, and they had already decided they knew he was guilty. They knew he should die. In fact, they had decided it ahead of time. It's written that in the discussion of the chief priest, they said, if he really was an innocent man, at least it'll be just one innocent man dying for the sake of the good of the whole, instead of letting this misguided guy pull a whole community off in the wrong direction and maybe lose our whole country, maybe lose all of our stability, many people lose their lives. It would be better for an innocent man to die than to have the rest of us suffer. And so this is how they justified the end. And so they justified the means to the end by bending corners at every turn. Now, I'm going to bet that if you read this on your own, maybe you have, maybe you're just hearing about it right now for the first time, that's cool too. But I'm going to bet if you read or listen to this, you think to yourself, there's no way I would ever do that. There's no way I would ever be like that. That's just some crazy level of nasty. It's obvious they're jealous, they're bothered, they're threatened, they're desperate, and they're just pushing this thing through and just trying to force it. And I'm going to bet that you think there's nothing really here for us to learn from this. But I want to challenge that. I want to ask you this. What happens when somebody looks at your life and they're not impressed? What happens when, somebody points out your faults? One or two or three or four of them, maybe all of them all at once. What happens when somebody just drops that in your lap and says, you know what, I don't think you really care about people. I don't think you're very honest, or I'm just not impressed. I think you're kind of greedy or self-indulgent or dishonest or whatever it is. And they just kind of put it out there, highlight a mistake you made, maybe a terrible failure that you had, or maybe one they just think that you had. How do you take that inside? The question is, are you tempted to take and maybe bend some corners a little bit? Maybe hurry up and rush to your own defense and try and find a way to prove them wrong or prove that they're bad instead of you, or maybe it turns into a wrestling match of some kind. Maybe there's some real tension there. But what happens in you when that takes place? See, it's actually not just a Pharisee thing or a Sadducee thing or a religious hypocrite thing. It's actually a human thing, especially like they had when they began to be threatened and called out on some things. They looked to their sense of identity and they said, this man, he threatens my sense of self-worth. He threatens who I am. He calls me out and says, I am not what I think that I am. It's a sign, when you feel those things, it's a sign that there is a part of your self-worth that comes not from where it should come from, but actually that it's built on something that maybe needs defense. Maybe it isn't that firm. Maybe it isn't that sure. Jesus, when he came, he said, listen, in his message, he said, I want you to repent. Repent. It means change your mind about how you see yourself. I want you to change your mind about how you perceive yourself, how you perceive where you are, how you stack up, how you measure up. And I want you to stop taking inventory of how good you are by looking and weighing at all the good things that you've done. Instead, what I want you to do is I want you to measure your worth based on your relationship with me. I want you to look at your relationship with me, and I want you to measure the quality of that, because that is actually your only hope of ever really being seen as good in the eyes of God. You just don't have it. You don't have enough good inside. You could try and you could summon up all the good that you can come up with, and you can really put the heat on it, and you can really go after it, and you can do a whole lot of good things. You can count them up. You can take a tally at the end of every day. But in the end, all of the good things that you have done, they can't reverse the things that you've done that weren't so good, the things that you disobeyed God on, knowing or without knowing. You can't erase that. You can't just make up for that or undo it by doing more good things. He says you actually need me to forgive you. You need to put your faith and your trust in me rather than try and quantify your good and look at that as the measure of your identity. And that flew in the face of everything that they knew. See, they had come up being raised right. They had learned God's commandment from an early age, His many commandments actually, learned them from an early age, and they'd been schooled in the Scriptures, and they had learned right from wrong, and they knew what honest was, they knew what dishonest was. They gave, and they prayed at the right intervals, and they did everything by the letter of the law, by the book. And the problem was that they were missing it. They missed some of the most important things. They missed what was going on inside their hearts while they were focusing on their tally sheets, on the good things that they could count and they could see and look back on and log away in a book someplace. Jesus came along and said, I don't want you to measure yourself that way anymore. I don't want you to measure yourself that way anymore. I want you to look at your relationship with me instead. So what I want you to think about as you take all this in is what happens in you when somebody challenges you? What happens when somebody takes a direct hit? When you take a direct hit to your perception, your self-image that you've built up for yourself. See, I think that if we look at what Jesus has done and what Jesus has said about us, we have the opportunity to build our identity and our sense of worth and peace around what He has done, instead of trying to quantify and build an identity for ourselves out of everything that we think that we've done that was good. I want you to this week take a moment and stop and ask yourself, what happens? And what happens if I start to think differently? What happens if I actually come back to what Jesus said, come back to the way that Jesus said I should think about myself? What happens then when I come back and I say, you know what? What if they're right? What if I did do a bad thing? What if I did have a failure? What if I did mess that up badly? What if I am greedier than I thought that I was? You see, there's safety in knowing that Jesus can account for all of our weakness. There's relief and there's peace when we know that we can come to Him and say, you know what, Jesus, you are absolutely right. You were right about me. You were right that I'm weak. You were right that aside from your goodness, I really don't have a leg to stand on. When we come back to Him, there's safety in that, and there's security, and there's peace, and you can have confidence. You can have confidence. But when you don't go to Jesus for your sense of identity, when you don't go there, you're actually at risk of doing some of the things that you don't admire or respect at all. In this story, these men, they looked at what Jesus was and they were threatened, and they said, you know what, we're going to bend every corner to win. We have to win. We're desperate to win. We need Jesus to not be the Lord, because if He is the Lord, then what He says about us is true, and we're challenged, and we can't take that. We cannot go down that route. We cannot afford it. We've spent our entire lives building our identities around this thing that we said that we are. We are the good guys. We're the good guys. And everybody else is the bad guys. Jesus says, no, actually, when you do that, you've flip-flopped it. You got it. You got it wrong. you got it wrong. Jesus says to you, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. Nobody comes to the Father through me. He said it this way in John. He said, I'm the vine, and you're the branches. My Father's the vine dresser. You can see this in John 15 if you want some reading for this week while you're all cooped up. I'm the vine, you're the branches. Apart from me, you can't do anything. See, he's saying your identity and my identity. I am a vine and you're the branches. You're a branch from me and you're meant to be in relationship with me, and it's the quality of your relationship that matters. When you start to differ from that and head down a different path, you don't have enough goodness. You will not produce enough goodness. You will not be fruitful. And so when my Father comes along, he's looking for fruit, but he knows that as long as you're connected with me in relationship, you will bear fruit. And so he works on you like a vine dresser does. He snips and trims and tunes and he feeds the vine. If you're connected with me, you have every reason to have confidence in front of God the Father. That's the message I want to leave with you this week. And I hope that you're doing well. I hope that you're not sick. I'm praying for everybody out there today. I know that some of this stuff is scary. We don't know what's going to happen, and there's just a lot of uncertainty and tension and annoyance out there. But above all of that, I want you to hear the words of Jesus to you this morning. And feel free to replay this message a few times if you're not quite sure what I meant, and meditate on that a little bit and see what comes to you and see what God speaks to you. I'll see you soon.